Alright, so today we're going to be adding an X and a Y button right next to the triggers on the top of the Steam Deck. Just makes the controls just that much more versatile, easier to use, and makes FPS a little bit more fun. They're pressure sensitive, so they're very responsive, and they kind of look janky a little bit, but they work super well, and you really barely have to press them to even trigger an action. And where I got this inspiration from was my first controller mod that I did to my Xbox 360 controller. I added a X and a Y and an A and a B button to the top and into the inside grip area. So the X is on the right hand side on the top, Y is on the left hand side on the top, A is on the right hand side inside the controller grip, and B is on the left hand side on the controller grip. So I never had to take my right thumb off the joystick to, say, switch weapons, reload, use equipment, whatever the case might be. Pretty crude in there too. Have a bunch of tape holding the wires down. I soldered directly to the pads themselves. Here's where the wires go to the back with these monstrous connectors that I had on tap and really couldn't use anything else because I didn't know much anything else. Had to do little cutouts inside the controller to fit the actual physical button that I epoxied in place here on the cap and inside of the controller grip too for the A and B button on the grip. So I turned the wireless controller into wired, but as I use this on PC, there's really no need to use it wireless. They responded very quickly. They're just in the reach of my tip of my fingers. I could have scooted them towards the outside of that little battery case, but it worked well, except for the A button, which was inside the controller grip there on the right hand side. That button just was very inconsistent sometimes and was hard to deal with. I never ended up switching it out, but I found this other controller by Razer, the Wolverine V2 Chroma. Excuse the dustiness of it. But this controller, completely wired as well, had the buttons on top and was perfect for what I needed it for. Just one of those extra buttons on top and then a few around the back that I can hit with my middle finger, because that's basically the only finger I use for these back M buttons, M4 and M5. M6. I can't remember what they're named, but the worst part of this controller was the trigger stops. I guess I'm pretty aggressive with the trigger, so using the trigger stops, I think I've broken the mount of just the right hand trigger. So it kind of wobbles back and forth, but still works exactly as it did before it was broken. But I use this on a daily basis. I'm just showing you here how much different the triggers are. So this is what I've used for the mod. Got a soldering iron, side cutters, the actual pressure sensitive button itself, heat shrink tube, some solder, some flux. Got some connectors down here, both male, female, some wire, a lighter, wire strippers, some scissors, electrical tape, a multimeter, some VHB tape for the actual mounting of the button, an iFixit Protect toolkit, Steam Deck of course, a dock with HDMI and power. This is what I use specifically because I had to use the multimeter to test some test points on the circuit board itself, and then ground that, and then have a controller testing program open on the Steam Deck while I was testing the test points with the ground to find out where the A, B, X, Y buttons were exactly on the board itself, which I have labeled and I will show you guys later on in the video once I got the board out. So right now, just taking apart the Steam Deck. Make sure you take your SD card out if you have one in before taking the back cover off. Take out the 8 screws, separate them appropriately from where you took them out at. Take one of these oversized guitar picks and kind of stick it in between the back panel and basically I would say the front panel. And you get it off. Got the board right there. It'll be on the left side, right side if you got the Steam Deck facing you. So it's got the R on the actual board itself. You take this little metal pry tool, use the pointed side because I started using the flat side here starting, but it just wasn't doing it. The pointed side got right up in there and took the trigger right out really quickly. Make sure you don't lose the spring. It's very important. Then we're going to take out the mounting for the trigger itself. Make sure to separate the screws accordingly. Then we're going to take out the ribbon cables, every single one of them, because we'll be taking this board completely out of the system. And then we got 2 cables down there, the red and the black. I think that goes to the vibrator motor to the right trackpad. Take everything out. Take out the screws, 4 screws on this board. Separate them accordingly, of course. Take the board fully out. Had a little trouble getting it out. It was stuck on that little prong up there. So now that we've got the board out, here I'm going to show you where each button pad is. So we've got X, B, and then A and Y to each one of those pads. And then just a ground wire. And if you short a wire from this pad to the ground, you'll get a button press. And depending on which test point it is, you'll get A, B, X, or Y. So I chose X and Y because that's what I'm used to. So here I am doing the X button first. Sorry if it's a little out of frame. I've been filming this on my phone and didn't have the best setup, so please bear with me. I am also an amateur solderist, so don't roast me on my soldering skills because they are pretty much non-existent. So I got the X wire soldered up, about to do the Y wire. I had to do a measurement of it first to make sure it reached to the other side of the board, as the Y wire will be on the left hand. So I had to make sure it was long enough. And then I gave myself a little bit extra too, just in case. Got those soldered up. Not too bad. Gonna use some electrical tape just to keep the wire on the board, because when I was doing the Xbox controller button, I accidentally ripped one of the cables off the pad and ripped the pad off the board too, making fixing it very, very difficult. So just to eliminate that problem, I taped the entire cable to the board so I wouldn't accidentally rip the cable off the board and the pad it was soldered to as well. Here I'm getting one of the connectors. I got the female end of the connector. Gonna squeeze it down on there. Make sure it has a good connection. Get the heat shrink tube the right length. It's kind of a pain to do it with the wire strippers here. So I had to resort to using a little bit finer needle nose pliers. Even then I was still having trouble getting it just right. So I used the pliers for my iFixit kit just to get the tabs pre-bent before putting it on the wire, and then I can do a full crimp once it was on the wire. So I got a crimp around the sheathing of the wire and then a crimp around the actual stripped end of the wire too. Then do a little heat shrink tube. Good enough. So I'll also do that for the Y wire of 2. Now here I'm doing the ground wire for the X button, which is on the right hand. So it really doesn't have to be too long. Here I'm trying to make sure which ground pad I was going to use. So here I'm soldering a little bit onto this screw hole for the circuit board. In reality, I could have just stuck the wire underneath the screw on the top side when putting the board back in, which I did for the Y side, but since I was already soldering, I just soldered it on there. Nice and simple. So here's a little tricky. Because the test pad is like a thin plastic, keeping the soldering iron on one of the connectors for the pressure sensor melts the crimp of the connector on the bottom there, the middle connector, to the plastic part, when it could tear off really easily if you get it too hot. It could literally just separate. So I'm just kind of just barely touching it with a soldering iron to get the solder to stick. Kind of troublesome, and I left a little glob of solder on that positive side, but it ended up working anyways, and nobody's going to see it because the Steam Deck's going to be closed up and it's going to be way in there. And the Y side I saved for later because I didn't have too much time. But we're doing the Y side on this video as well, so not to worry. So I added I think it was about 2 to 3 inch leads on the connector itself, just to give myself enough room to open the case again if I needed to in the future and disconnect the button from the actual board itself. And then for the connectors, I used on the board, I used a female barrel connector. And then for the negative, I used a male. So it was alternating. And getting the board back in the system. Screw down the 4 screws exactly where they came from. I'm going to be putting the ribbon cables back into each slot. Make sure they're fully seated before putting down the locking tab. Here's a little close-up view. Get the vibrator motor plugged back in. And these 2 connectors down here as well. Make sure they're all fully plugged in. Make sure the locking tabs are down completely. put the trigger stop or the trigger mounting mechanism and stop. I guess it's a combo. Get that screwed back in with the exact same. And then I kind of lost the video of plugging it in and doing the final steps for the X side because I guess my phone ran out of storage. So I lost that. But here on the Y side, basically I'm gonna be covering everything that I didn't do on the X side. Gonna get the connectors crimped up on this, the negative for the Y side. Get them all crimped up. Heat shrink tube. Pretty simple, just a little bit tedious work. Heat shrink tube on. Actually have a heat gun this time instead of a lighter, so way easier. And then for this, instead of soldering the negative to one of the pads, I just used one of the screw posts, one of the screws. Much easier. Didn't have to break out the soldering iron. Again, I used some electrical tape just to keep the wire down so it doesn't get pulled out. Then for this, instead of soldering some leads to it, because this is the last pressure sensor that I had, and I didn't want to risk messing it up, so I just crimped the connectors right onto the sensor itself. And since my cables going from the board, both positive and negative, were long enough, I could do this. So I didn't need that little bit of extra length. It's about the same length. I think it was just a tad shorter than the X side, but it still ended up working pretty well. And for the sensor itself, I don't think it matters which side's negative and which side's positive. As long as the sensor is pressed, it'll short both the positive and the negative together. So as long as your wiring is correct on the board, it doesn't matter which side you plug it in on the sensor itself. So I could have swapped this and have the positive on the other side and the negative on the other side, basically swapped them, and the sensor would still work the same way. So I used electrical tape both on this side, which is the Y side, and the X side. I didn't show you the X side, of course, because I lost the video. But I just use some electrical tape to make sure it doesn't short on anything, doesn't hit any pins or anything in the Steam Deck itself. Just a safety precaution. Because even with the heat shrink tubing, there was still a tad bit of connector showing, so better safe than sorry. Then kind of put the sensor, the pressure sensor, where I wanted it. Use some electrical tape just to hold it in there as a temporary solution, just in case I wanted to move these at all. It wasn't really permanent onto the plastic itself. Put the VHB tape down, kind of stuck it down a little bit. Make sure you hold it down so the VHB can actually stick pretty well. Get those wires shoved up in there. Make sure you test your rear paddle buttons on the Steam Deck to make sure they are functioning properly, because sometimes the cables can get in the way. So I had a little bit of trouble there where one was getting in the way, so I just kind of got to move it a little bit just to make sure it's out of the way, kind of stuff it down. Seems kind of crude, but it works great. And the VHB for this side here is just wasn't sticking very well. I think I touched it too much. So got a new little piece, stuck it down. a little too long, so I had to trim it up just a tad. As long as the VHP doesn't get too dirty, it sticks very well and doesn't move. And the VHP is nice because it's kind of squishy, so you can kind of get the little bit of feedback when you press on the pressure sensor. So the only downside to these pressure sensors as buttons is that there's very little feedback once you press on them. So you don't get a click. There's not much movement to it since it's just a tiny little piece of plastic on a fairly thin piece of tape. Here I'm showing you the finished product. Got X on the right side, Y on the left side, and the triggers and the X and Y. So X and Y still work on the face buttons too. So I just kind of tapped into it and made an extension. They're in a really good place for at least my hand type, kind of medium-sized hands. So when I got my fingers resting on the triggers, I can hit the X and Y at any time. And they're quick. You can see how quick these are. With like very little travel, I can hit them very fast. Here I'm showing you just kind of like a top-down view. They are not mapped to any of the back buttons, and these are them actually in working order. Just gonna do some gaming test real fast. Gonna play MCC and then play Halo Infinite. Fortunately, MCC still does not work through online, I should say. You can still play campaign and anything locally, which is nice if you just want to tinker around, just play a few missions here and there. But as for online, it still doesn't work, fortunately. And for some reason, while playing this, I didn't even notice when I was playing. It's not that both games are running at 30 frames per second for some reason. I have the Steam Deck set to 60, but sometimes it does this where when you start a game, like in the menus, it was 60 frames per second. I start the game and it's at 30. Just could be maybe from an update I had, or maybe the game is overriding for some reason, even though the game's set at 60. So here's the buttons in action. In game. Y is switch weapon. X is to reload. Just doing some short testing, showing you how it works. I use Bumper Jumper for Halo, so everything's pretty much at my fingertips. So I really never have to take my thumbs off the joystick at all, both joysticks. So sorry about the aiming for this, as like I was saying before, the game's only running at 30. I did not know it. I would have changed it if I would have seen it while I was playing this, but fortunately I did not see it. So I'm running at 30 frames per second, and it was brutal. It was very hard to aim. especially when I run this game at 120 at 1440p on my desktop, which where I usually play MCC. So going from 120 to 30 and then 1440p to 800p, big difference. Also, the controllers are quite different from the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck joysticks seem a little bit, I would say, inconsistent. So I was trying to dial those in. I'm still trying to dial those in, from trying to get them to feel like the Razer Chroma controller I showed earlier in the video. So that was MCC, Halo 3, first mission. I'm going to play some Halo Infinite. Just a quick little demo. This game was also running at 30 frames per second for some reason, even though in-game settings is 60, and the Steam Deck is set to 60 as well. So don't know why it was locked to 30. Everything says 60. So usually what I get to do when this happens, I will go to the Steam Deck frame rate settings, go down to 30, go back up to 60, and the game will run at 60. So could be a Steam Deck setting. I'm running the beta version. Yeah, I think I'm running the beta version of the Steam operating system. So it could be that. It's gonna load into a bot game real fast, just to show you what it's like. Pretty much similar settings. Got the top buttons. The left hand side is Y, right hand side is X. I would have saved the audio for this gameplay, but it just really sounded bad filming from my phone and then coming from the Steam Deck speakers. Just the audio quality was horrible. Man, my aim was absolutely horrible on this. Like, look at me trying to track that guy. That was wretched. Overall, this mod, fairly simple. The outcome is great. It makes the Steam Deck much more versatile. A little bit more fun to play too, adding those 2 extra buttons. What's great about the Steam Deck operating system software is that you can change the X and Y button basically to anything you want. So if I wanted to switch it to A and B, I can still switch it to A and B just fine. Or if I wanted to switch it to a bumper, I could do that too. I know there's probably some limitations to that I haven't really delved deeper into, but I don't really plan on switching them that drastically for my situation and my playstyle. So they're mostly going to be X and Y buttons, unless occasional game has a little bit different button layout, then I can change it to what I need to change it to. But yeah, that's it. Very versatile. Pretty easy mod to do if you don't care about your warranty, because this will definitely void your warranty, so do at your own risk. But overall, I love it. This is great.